It's interesting you keep talking about amnesia.
Hmm.
You've been reading something this book you wanted to tell me about. Are you gonna talk to me about this?
Yeah.
I possibly relevant to this problem of creating mythology and how do we do it and where does it come from? Yeah.
Yes. So I've, well, I like tumbling down rabbit holes,
Okay.
as you know.
You promised me a
And
rabbit
so
hole. I collected some
I
pictures,
did.
but I think we'll see where we go.
Well, I bought this gem, which is a study on myth, magic, and metamorphosis in the Italic branch of the Western inner traditions.
Mm.
It's called the Magic Door. It's fantastic. So I've been going through this for the last little while as a part of our reading for Draco
Mm.
Alchemicus, and the 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 whole book is a description on the Greco-Roman formation of the mythology of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
And so a big part of this is how to recall origins and recall the roots of a particular civilization. So it's been interesting reading this as we are now being asked to recall the roots of Australia in British Empire and British civilization and what that means. Um, and yeah, we've got a big memory problem in Australia. Which I've known for some time, but after reading this, it's really, uh, it's very obvious. We have a memory problem.
Well, take us in. Take us through this magic door. Where should we
Well,
start?
oh, should we go through? We might not ever come out. So there was a
Well, yeah,
there
we
was a
go
little
down
bit
the
of a
rabbit hole. I mean, we end up in the I'd say some kind of mystery library of knowledge and how to I all so I've titled this. I've told people that we're talking about the architecture of memory tonight, and why should I set it up that way based on the hints that you give me that are in this book? Okay, we kind of planned this ahead of times, but I don't know what she's been reading, so we need to
no.
delve into this. She's promised me secrets.
I am revealing. I'm revealing all. So this is a basically a look at the role of Hermeticism in the Greek and Roman cult practices, and it's a brief overview of why ritual was so important in ancient Rome in forming the Republic, and then later on in the imperial era of the Roman Empire.
Mm.
Um, and having an understanding of the tradition in Roman life, which was trying to tap into a kind of ancestral mythology in order to realize Roman identity. So part of this was the mastery and manipulation of memory through all of these mnemonic techniques. And it sounds very woo woo because it is. um, they were essentially practicing a kind of occult magic system in order to formulate national identity
Mm.
in Rome. And a big emphasis on this was on their ability to recall their identity as connected to Aeneas and the story of the Aeneid. So that's kind of where we get started on the magic door.
Okay.
So this particular person that I wanted to ask you about, because I know that you've been doing some work on architecture as well.
Mm.
They were mastering a mnemonic practice or the art of memory and something that was called the theater of ideas, in that they would create a kind of memory palace and construct a Roman identity based on this internal theatre. So it kind of links to everything that was going in terms of the link between pageantry and the formation of an identity based on roots and origins, the origin story of a civilization, these kinds of things. And of course, it's triggered me because Australians don't have this at all. So we return back to what exactly is Australia, because Romans existed because of their foundational mythology and these cult practices, which were linking them to continuous remembrance of their origins, their mythological origins. Whereas Australia doesn't have this, even though we're still technically a part of the British Commonwealth, and even though the Queen is sovereign of the country, we haven't talked about this at all. We never discuss it, but in the Queen's passing, it's become a sort of a total recall that we're a part of the British system. So, yeah.
Okay, so this is the problem of the study of history. Although I think from what you've told me about the book, he's doing something a little different from simply saying we study history. But I think it is yes, topical to the kinds of discussions that we keep ending up in our Telegram channels and generally online. And I mean, also feeding into the kinds of arguments that are floating around out there about defining nationalism and what is it, and
yes,
and whether, I mean, that this phrase Christian nationalism that's been going around. But this is simply saying there's something, I mean, you said mystical or woo-woo. How does a nation understand itself to exist? It's fundamental. I mean, it's interesting. A fundamental sociological problem, a historical problem, spiritual problem of why do we the phrase, the term that has been bouncing around in my other discussions this week is egregor, right? These collective entities that somehow create a feeling of like angelic existence. That in antiquity, that angelic existence of the collective was defined as the genius of a city or the god, the divinity. That Rome has a reality to the ancient Romans, not just as this, I mean, they have maps, but they're not like our maps, but not just as this location in place, but as somehow existing through all of this collective consciousness. Neither of those terms that they would be using in the period. Say more about the memory system that I'm used to thinking of is the one that the rhetoricians use to give their speeches, and they go through. There's, I mean, I have pictures of some of the ways that people use this kind of structure famously in the Renaissance period, where they'll imagine a location and then imagine different vivid scenes in different parts of the location, and by way of taking themselves through this building, as it were, they can recall very elaborate speeches and so forth. And that training in rhetoric is known throughout the Middle Ages. It's known into the Renaissance, and some people became very famous at being able to remember like whole, sort of encyclopedias of information because of the way they train themselves. What you're describing, what's the author of your book that you're looking at?
David Pantano.
Okay, what Pantano is describing seems to be building a little bit more than on just that ability to structure knowledge. It has this esoteric or mystical feel to it as well.
It definitely does. He's sort of talking about the two ways in which the mastery of memory was used. One was in the oratory, so for the rhetorical, for people being able to remember raw data. And the other way was in that what people were remembering and forgetting essentially constructs their identity.
Okay.
So this is the more mystical element to it, in that the Romans were seeking to guarantee that Romans would always remember a particular mythological narrative about their own origins in order to retain Romanness.
Okay.
And that the techniques that they were doing in order to guarantee this were somewhat magical in the sense that they wanted.
Yeah, what does he mean by
to,
magic in this sense? That's very interesting. Because I mean, there's the sort of heroic ability of these Renaissance memory artists to remember stuff. I mean, the most famous one, and maybe I'll show his instead of this one. I was showing Camillus's, but I can show Giordano Bruno's. Yeah. This vast, like, you know, sort of network of all of these associations. Bruno was considered magical in his ability to recall stuff, but what you're describing sounds a little different.
Well, they wanted that ability to be able to have a recollection because, according to this writer, the idea of being the dominant power was the ability to remember and to be the repository of history. And so if Romans themselves had forgotten their mythological origins, they were no longer masters of history and masters of time. So they had to remember themselves in order to then be able to maintain their Romanness and therefore their empire. And so in terms of how it was seen as magical, I found this really interesting. It was a series of initiatory practices, and so essentially they were going through initiations into pagan ritual in order to train memory to be able to do this. And later on, post-Renaissance, a lot of Italian societies were set up to continue these practices, including people that had gone on to form the fascist movement in Italy. So it was very interesting reading this, that the ability to recall mythological origins in order to then retain memory and retain the ability to master history had followed through all the way up until the fascist era. And these, what most people would look at as very hyper-rational people, were actually very interested in the kind of occult manipulation of their own psychology. So in terms of what they wanted to do was bind the Roman mind there by creating a particular architecture of what it meant to be Roman. There are these horrendous buildings in Rome, because I've been there quite a few times.
Okay, tell us about Rome.
And horrendous buildings, all the stuff Mussolini and the fascists constructed. It's so ugly compared to the rest of the city. And I knew someone who was kind of working on fascist architecture a while back, but it was hilarious because you kind of drive around, you've got all of these beautiful palazzi and, you know, gorgeous old buildings everywhere, and then all of a sudden you're kind of smacked in the face by this brutal cube of sort of arrogant ugliness that doesn't belong anywhere.
Yeah.
And every time I'd see one, my friends would say, it's a Mussolini construction. It was really awful. Why anyone would admire the fascists based on that one thing alone. They did not have a flair for design at all. Not.
Well, what I'm thinking
it was not ancient Rome. You know, they didn't have the flair of the ancient Romans.
Rome as a city itself is a marvelous example of the layering of this exercise, because
Mm.
it is so many different cities all in. When I've been there,
Okay.
I think it's one of the other theaters, and you see one of these ancient theaters, maybe the Theater of Marcellus, that's built up later as it feels like it's an early modern palace or something like that, and they just build themselves onto, you know, that it's like Rome is built on Rome, but it's Rome built with Rome, right? It's like they grab rock and stone from one
Mhm.
place and build something else with it, and then add another bit onto that, and that it's, as a city itself, so many different mythologies all in this architectural layering. They know how to do it definitely in Rome, but but then Mussolini came along and he had to write and build new ones, a new version of the mythology, because his is somewhat different from, Dante wasn't in Rome, so that's not relevant. But each of the
Yes.
layers there, the Catholic one is different from the medieval one is different from the Baroque Catholic, which is different from the 19th century nationalist, which is different from the fascist 20th century, which is different yet again from whatever the
You kind
20th
of
century is built on top of that.